Start the recording. So welcome again to October 2024's ODSECS, where our speaker is Ros Powell. It's my very great pleasure to introduce Ros, who is an assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam. Before that, she was a much valued colleague at the University of Bristol, where she was a senior lecturer in 18th century studies. Nothing's quite worked the same since Ros left, and I'm not sure that's a coincidence. Ros does some really exciting and innovative research that combines literary studies, science, and religion in the long 18th century. Her first book was on Christopher Smart and was published in 2014. And her second book, Perception and Analogy, was published in 2021. And explores the use of figurative language in literary and scientific discourse. I got a chance to have a sneak peek at some of that, and it's a really fantastic book. I really enjoyed it and would recommend it to you. As well as these other publications, Ros has published very widely on a number of topics, including artificial reproduction, on categorization, and on the boundaries between the human and other forms of life. I think it's fair to say that Ros has written the most interesting essay on polyps that I will ever read. And again, it's really, really good. I learned so much. Ros's current project is on self-experimentation and narrative in the 18th century. And I think it's work that's grown out of that research that Ros will be sharing with us this afternoon. With the wonderful and very evocative title, Inspiration, Oxygen and the Self, Some Narratives of Body Knowledge. Ros, it's very much over to you.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Right. Okay, so in lines written in early spring, Wordsworth hypothesizes that every flower enjoys the air it breathes. He stated his happy theory some 2 decades after Joseph Priestley had described the relationship between animal respiration and plants' absorption and release of gases. In the 1775 volume of experiments and observations on different kinds of air, Priestley explained this process in terms of fixed air, our carbon dioxide, exhaled by animals and absorbed by plants, and dephlogisticated air, our oxygen, released by plants and inhaled by animals. Wordsworth's framing in terms of breathing plants accords with this scheme, and later in the poem he describes how budding twigs spread out their fan to catch the breezy air, and he notes there was pleasure there. Wordsworth's connection between air's respiration and enjoyment echo Priestley's own practice, as he invoked the qualitative value of airs and the subjective experience of respiration a number of times in his work. In the last 3 decades of the 18th century, inspiration, or inhalation, was employed as an experimental technique, combining tacit knowledge with sensory experience. For thinkers like Priestley and Thomas Beddoes, the thinking and breathing body became part of the experimental process, though they only employed respiration as an occasional instrument, and trials with apparatus, animals and plants are much more common. So the end point of this period of experimental inhalation was the much more famous trials on the physical and psychological effects of laughing gas. But I want to go back to basics and to explore instead the respiration of oxygen. Now, while it's a common activity to all of us, breathing, as modern commentators also recognise, is more than simply reflective action, not least because it can be controlled or manipulated and can affect or be affected by experiences, environments, and relationships. So this is part of a broader project I'm working on, as Ian said, on self-experimentation and self-measurement. Of the different kinds of self-experimentation I've been looking at, including dietary trials and the self-testing of potential new medicines like hemlock, the simple act of inhaling something as commonplace as oxygen seems quite dull. However, by paying attention to how natural philosophers deploy strategic acts of breathing and strategic ways of describing those acts, we can learn much about the construction and communication of chemical knowledge and the people championing it in this period. And we can also learn about the valuation of airs in this period. So this is really very much a work in progress as part of my current book project on self-experimentation and self-measurement. And I've been thinking about the place of the self in scientific texts and how operations involving the self do legitimize new claims to knowledge. So it's also linked to who gets to be a scientist in this period. But these uses of the self also require legitimization in order to be taken seriously. So it's the narratives that scientists tell, not the self-experiments themselves, that make them science. I'm applying a literary critical analysis of science writing in this project. So I'm following critics like Courtney Weiss-Smith, Stephen Chopin, and of course Tita Chico. So I'm going to start by talking about Priestley. Johnson's 1755 dictionary lists two separate definitions for pneumatic: the modern doctrine of the air, or laws according to which that fluid is condensed, rarefied, or gravitates, and the medieval scholastic doctrine of spiritual substances as gods, angels, and the souls of men. This connection between the scientific and the spiritual is also visible in the dual meaning of inspiration. For Priestley, whose volumes on pneumatics combine scientific and theological purpose, these are not empty puns. In his memoirs, he described his work as a dissenting minister and thinker as the great object of his studies. Even in his chemical publications, he was keen to emphasize that his investigations were only occasional offshoots from the more serious business of theology. Strikingly, in the prefaces to his experiments and observations on different kinds of air, Priestley outlines his scientific aims in terms of belief. In the second volume, where the groundbreaking experiments with dephlogisticated air are outlined, he presents himself as follows. He says, "There's nothing capital in this volume from which I can hope to derive any other kind of honour than that of being the instrument in the hands of divine providence, which makes use of human industry to strike out and diffuse that knowledge of the system of nature which seems for some great purpose that we cannot as yet fully comprehend to have been reserved for this age of the world." The explicit depersonifying of this image, the scientist as instrument, his processes making use of human industry, buffets against Priestley's persona as a preacher of natural philosophy, an instrument of God spreading knowledge by explaining the created system to others. His millenarian concept of privileged knowledge of chemistry reserved for the present moment is a variation on the contingency of scientific facts. So the experiments and observations combine self-presentation with practical descriptions, and this results in a fairly distinctive narrative mode. In his memoirs, Priestley claims that he actually knew very little of chemistry at the beginning of his experiments, describing as his main source of information a course of lectures delivered in the Academy at Warrington by Dr. Turner of Liverpool. He began experimenting during his spell in Leeds as minister to the Mill Hill Chapel between 1767 and 1773. During this period, he lived next to a public brewery, and this gave him ample access to fixed air or carbon dioxide, of which he noted there is always a large body ready formed upon the surface of fermenting liquor. His first experiments involved the carbonation of water to make exceedingly pleasant sparkling water, and he also experimented with the gas and demonstrating how it killed animals and how it also transformed the colours of different plants. Forced to make his own fixed air when he moved house, he developed apparatus of the cheapest kind so that he could continue his experiments. So there's an emphasis here on an improvisatory, cumulative acquisition of chemical knowledge, but Priestley's also really careful to emphasise his rightful place in chemical society. In the early stages, Priestley demonstrates his knowledge and manual skill by repeating the processes of his predecessors, Cavendish, Hales, and McBride. And crucially, he also suggests that the approach he takes as a relative outsider contributes towards the novelty and insight of his observations. He says, "If I'd been previously accustomed to the usual chemical processes, I should not have so easily thought of any other, and without new modes of operation, I should hardly have discovered anything materially new." Priestley also emphasises the importance of tacit knowledge, and this is a theme that's really important for my whole project on self-experimentation. Priestley reminds his readers that there are many little attentions and precautions necessary to be observed in the conducting of experiments, which is needless to describe, since practice will necessarily suggest them. He's referencing here a kind of body knowledge that's less about knowing theory and methods and more about craft, where it is only much practice that can enable a person to go through complex experiments with ease. In fact, in his efforts to disseminate his new experimental observations, Priestley did go as far as to train a number of popular science lecturers including Benjamin Dodd and John Walter, to ensure that they knew the practical techniques necessary to be able to reproduce his experiments. And this is significant because whilst much of the experiments and observations is concerned with the interactions between various gases and other organisms, including mice and plants, Priestley's valuation of different kinds of air is also bound up with his own sensory and bodily skill. So deep breath, here's a little bit of chemistry. Priestley's main observations about oxygen, or rather dephlogisticated air, are connected to his central claim that common air is not a simple elementary substance, but that it's a compound which can be altered by plant and animal respiration and by combustion. His guiding assumption is in the existence of phlogiston, which, following Georg and Stahl, he understands as the combustive element that is released into the air when elements are burnt or vegetable or animal matter putrefies, and it's corrected by plant life back into respirable air. Priestley routinely employs words like noxious and badness to describe air that's affected by phlogiston, and purity or goodness to describe respirable air. So that language of variation, of valuation is really common in his writing. Most famously, Priestley isolated dephlogisticated air by heating various compounds in air, including a red powder mercurius calcinatus, our mercuric oxide, in an experiment that Lavoisier would later repeat. He also explored the relationship between dephlogisticated air and respiration by observing its action on the blood. Dephlogisticated air makes blood very red. A frequent test that recurs throughout his trials is the nitrous air test, which demonstrates the presence of dephlogisticated air in a given sample. The sample is mixed with nitrous air, and the degree to which it bubbles and diminishes in volume corresponds to the presence of dephlogisticated air, and could, in Priestley's parlance, therefore provide a scale to measure the goodness of the air. Throughout his reports on the different kinds of air, Priestley emphasises that his experiments were not led by hypotheses about their outcomes. His investigations into dephlogisticated air and the composition of common air are instead punctuated by his constant expressions of surprise at experiential outcomes. And this is a narrative strategy that we can see as part of his self-fashioning. I'll give you a few examples. In August 1774, Priestley first employed a burning glass to heat what we now call mercuric oxide. In his report, he registers his surprise that the process results in air that behaves differently from common air. It causes a candle to burn with an enlarged and vigorous flame, and Priestley comments that he was utterly at a loss as how to account for it. At this point, he notes, he had no suspicion that the air which I had got was even wholesome. On continuing experiments a few months later, he was, he says, surprised to discover that agitation in water didn't affect the air produced by burning the mercuric oxide. A candle still burned in it, he says, with a strong flame, and it did not in the least diminish common air. He's much more surprised the next day that after overnight contact with water, the air produced still sustains combustion. And he's more surprised than ever he had been before to discover that a candle will burn in a mixture of nitrous air and the new air left overnight. This escalating narrative of surprise and encountering the properties of the new gas both underpins the experience of experiment and underlines the chemist's determination to avoid hypothesizing. The story Priestley is telling here is one of cumulative individual discovery. He stresses reports of activities and instances rather than theories. At the end of the second volume, he refutes Lavoisier's criticisms of his work. And this is a fairly minor case, but he corrects the former's summary that snails die immediately and recoverably in fixed air, with a rather testy retort that I only mentioned a single experiment with one particular snail. Another way of looking at this, which brings together Priestley's chemistry with his theological preoccupations, is to think about his experiments in terms of the gradual building of associations. In other words, his narratives show the process of knowledge acquisition. So, in March 1775, he tells his reader how he ascertained the nature of this kind of air, though very gradually, but was led to it by the complete discovery of the constitution of the air we breathe. At this point, living subjects are introduced. As Priestley says, I wanted a mouse to make the proof quite complete. The mouse lives considerably longer than it would have done in the same volume of common air, and it recovers afterwards, showing the gas to be at least as good as common air. Priestley also carried out the nitrous air test before then introducing his own process of inhalation. And I'll read this out for you. My reader will not wonder that, after having ascertained the superior goodness of dephlogisticated air by mice living in it, and the other tests above mentioned, I should have the curiosity to taste it myself. I have gratified that curiosity by breathing it, drawing it through a glass siphon, and by this means I reduced a large jar full of it to the standard of common air. The feeling of it to my lungs was not sensibly different from that of common air, but I fancied that my breast felt peculiarly light and easy for some time afterward. Who can but tell, but in time this pure air may become a fashionable article in luxury. Hitherto only 2 mice and myself have had the privilege of breathing it. So here Priestley introduces the reader's own expectations, sparking their desire for involvement in the experimental process. The inhalation of the gas is prompted by curiosity rather than an experimental project. The chemist is a privileged, distinguished taster of a new delicacy. And this emphasis on exclusivity is balanced by the employment of Priestley's own sensory experience of the gas to evaluate the physical sensations it causes. The description of the feeling of it in the lungs is quite tentative. Priestley's hesitant to push the description beyond a fancied sensation. Priestley was clearly conscious of the steps needed to authorize self-experimentation. Notably, in the 1787 portion of his memoirs, he ends with a more general assessment of his life up to this point, including his bodily health. He describes a happy temperament of body and mind, both derived from my parents, which is only marred by an ulcer on his lungs, which he put down to too much cross-country and cold bathing at school. He explains, though, how moderation, including a vegetable diet, has allowed him a life of good health. The most important element of this narrative is Priestley's argument for his particular fitness for theology and natural philosophy. He says, I think it is an advantage to me, and I'm truly thankful for it, that my health received the check that it did when I was young, since a muscular habit from high health and strong spirits are not, I think, in general accompanied with that sensibility of mind, which is both favourable to piety and speculative pursuits. Priestley's body awareness and regulation is directed outwards to the experimental or theological process. And in this case, the assessment of the gases that he's examining. The experimenter's body, which is employed to inhale and assess gases, is presented as dependable. Priestley shows himself to be accustomed to taking notice of his physical form and sensation. The difficulty of using inhalation as a mode of measurement is a topic to which he turned in 1790, where he documented a more detailed account of the processes of respiration by inhaling the equivalent quantities of common and dephlogisticated air to determine what remains in the body after exhalation. This later process places Priestley's own body alongside the standard apparatus as part of the precise process of measurement, repetition, and analysis. So he inhaled equal volumes of atmospheric air and dephlogisticated air to determine that in each case, a high proportion of the dephlogisticated air was absorbed by the body. Priestley notes that the instrumentalization of the body requires constant calibration to check against natural impulses. Judgment is needed to ensure that the quantity inhaled and exhaled is not affected over time by fatigue. I was aware of this circumstance, he says, and endeavoured to obviate the effects of it by leaving off with my lungs as nearly as I could judge in the same state of distension as when I began. And this process reinforces Simon Schaffer's point about auto-experimentation requiring the experimenter to become a puppet master over himself. So this sensory approach to valuing different gases that I've been talking about was challenged by Antoine Laurent Lavoisier, who displaced the phlogiston theory to which Priestley was committed. Lavoisier was 13 years Priestley's junior and certainly not self-taught. He presented a system of quantitative chemistry that struck a different note to Priestley's cumulative narratives of discovery. He conducted his work in comparatively lavish laboratories, of the kind which prompted one British visitor to describe Lavoisier as splendidly lodged and with every appearance of a man of considerable fortune. As Jan Galinsky notes, Priestley would not have approved of this kind of expenditure, which would limit the possibilities of replication by readers. Lavoisier's elementary treatise on chemistry, which presents the new system he's developed as a series of facts rather than gradually accumulated chemical experiences, Lavoisier emphasizes precision in measurement. He describes how the weight gained by an oxidized substance is the same as the amount of air diminished. And this approach is representative of a general interest in what oxygen does and how it interacts with other substances, rather than what it feels like to the individual. As his work on the necessity for sufficient oxygen in public spaces, such as theatres and hospitals, shows, he was also interested in the human ends of pneumatic chemistry. But the means for obtaining this knowledge was always measurement and never feeling. Lavoisier prompted readers, including Beddoes, my next candidate, to shed their commitment to phlogiston theory. By focusing on precise measurement, Lavoisier was able to show that the process of calcination, what we now call oxidation, results in increased mass, whereas the combustion of a calcinated substance results in decreased mass as the oxygen is released. And this is physically quite the opposite of phlogistication, in which theory phlogiston is theoretically released in calcination. A side effect of all of this is that we can now call this respirable gas oxygen. So as I've said, Lavoisier's technique differs from Priestley's cumulative life writing, and it's more focused on presenting complete quantitatively proved theories. One set of experiments on the physiology of respiration does provide a tantalizing point of comparison with Priestley's attention to his own breathing. Like Priestley, Lavoisier's initial experiments on respiration involved animal subjects, but on the 13th of November 1790, he published a report co-authored with Armand Séguin that involves a human subject to determine the chemical process of respiration in terms of what precisely goes in and out. This is now better known because of the visual depiction created by Madame Paul's Lavoisier, and we can see here the experimental subject, and Beretta identifies this as Séguin, clothed in a garment of taffeta coated with elastic rubber that allowed neither air nor humidity to penetrate, and he's equipped with a respiration tube. And this is the description in the report. By weighing oneself before entering the apparatus and then after coming out of it, the difference gave the loss of in weight due to the united effects of respiration and transpiration. By weighing oneself in a few seconds after entering the apparatus and a few seconds before leaving it, one has the loss of weight due exclusively to the effects of respiration. So we have a complex physical separation of sweat and breath here. And it's showing the lengths to which this experiment is going to mechanize the body's processes in order to understand them and then to understand what the body how the body interacts with air. The rubber suit that is worn indicates a transformation from feeling subject to experimental subject, and sensations are not included in the data. So I'm going to move on to my final inhaling experimenter who drew on the work of both Priestley and Lavoisier. This is Thomas Beddoes. Beddoes' interest in the relationship between air and health is now most often connected to the Pneumatic Institution in Bristol, where Humphrey Davy and others inhaled laughing gas. That institution was initially interested in the urgent medical problem of consumption or pulmonary tuberculosis and its potential medical treatment with gases. Tuberculosis was a significant cause of death in the late 18th century, and Beddoes cited bills of mortality recording that 1 in 4 people in Britain died from the disease. Propelled by frequent encounters with the sufferings of his consumptive patients and their families, Beddoes' work in pneumatic medicine offers another dimension of thinking about the goodness of air. The early stages of consumption manifested through signs such as foul-smelling breath and coughing, and it's only reasonable, therefore, that the air in one's environment might be thought to be the cause. In his early treatments of consumption, Beddoes employed a pneumatic machine to mix air to make it more palatable and respirable for patients, producing a treatment referred to by one young recipient as Dr. Beddoes' breath. Now, while he was not a dissenter like Priestley, Beddoes did exist on the fringes of 1790's scientific society. His public vocal support for the French Revolution and other democratic ideals, including his censure of the East India Company's power abuses and vocal criticism of the situation of the poor in England, saw him branded a radical. And this position led him to abandon a post at Oxford in 1793 to pursue his pneumatic research, and these activities received little support from either the Royal Society or his alma mater. Beddoes' aim of chemically producing health was particularly focused on consumptive patients and a democratic aim of treating the poor for free. His 1793 volumes, Observations on the Nature and Cure of Calculus, Sea Scurvy, Consumption, Catarrh, and Fever, and A Letter to Erasmus Darwin, demonstrate his early conviction that diseases are caused by an excess or paucity of oxygen. In the Observations, he looks ahead to a future of pneumatic medicine, which he articulates as a corrective against what he sees as the overprescription of treatments in a system where the physician stalks abroad with an air of greater dignity when he feels a full quiver at his shoulders, however blunt it may be the arrows it contains. Beddoes' conviction that inhalation can be used as part of treatment for consumption is based on a combination of the observation of patients and animal subjects, witness accounts, induction, and self-experimentation. The 3 volumes of Considerations on the Medicinal Use and on the Production of Factitious Airs advertise his new medical practice to others to gain support for his plan for a medical pneumatic institution. So these volumes, co-written with James Watt, also include information about the relative apparatus for making the gases and for transporting the gas to patients. In the 3rd volume, for example, there's a description of the setup and use of a portable version for which only a common parlour or kitchen fire is needed to produce pure oxygen or hydrocarbonate air with which to dilute common air. In this volume, Beddoes also encourages his readers to experience for themselves how respiration affects the state of air. This is early in the volume. He describes a process that's familiar from previous chemists' experiments. He says, fix a pipe to a bladder full of air and holding your nostrils, breathe the air for some time, and your distressed feelings will inform you that it is no longer fit for breathing. Now, the communicative function of these instructions is to show the validity of individual experience for establishing knowledge. The indicative value of breathing efforts is actually a touchstone of Beddoes' medicine, and he pioneers a practice of adjusting the proportion of oxygen in air to make it more tolerable for patients. Beddoes includes witness accounts from other physicians who have applied aerial medicine in their treatments. They've temporarily eased consumption with common air adjusted with hydrogen air, later adjusted with hydrocarbonate air. They've diluted common air to ease the symptoms of asthmatic patients, and even eye conditions and ailments such as external ulcers have been treated with regimes of oxygen inhalation. In his early speculations on the subject of consumption, Beddoes' assessment of pure oxygen is coloured by his assertion that it's more difficult to breathe than common air is. He notes that animals have always appeared to me to suffer extremely soon after immersion in unmixed oxygen air, but that humans' reaction to inhaling pure oxygen is variable and individual. To my own lungs, he says, it feels like ardent spirits applied to the palate, and I've often thought I could not survive the inspiration of oxygen air many minutes. By describing his own feelings and prompting readers, including other physicians, to consider their feelings, Beddoes both promotes the validity of his diagnostic sensation, and he also encourages a sympathetic approach to relieving the respiratory experiences of patients. This also explains his rationale for citing case studies from other physicians' treatment, wherein both physician and patient acts as witness. He says, I've always requested that the patient might be solicited to allow his name and designation to appear. I've admitted no endeavour to procure from the patient himself a description of his own feelings, and I've frequently been so fortunate as to obtain the attestation of a second professional person. So there's a stress here on both witnessing, as we might expect, but also on feeling. Feeling is an important part of method and treatment. How does Beddoes get to this point? In a letter to Erasmus Darwin, Beddoes suggests that both food and gases have a nutritive capacity. He says it's impossible to doubt that we are nourished by the lungs as truly as by the stomach, and what we take in at the former entrance becomes, like our food, a part of the substance of our body, our solids as well as of our fluids. Beddoes considered the general properties and effects of pure oxygen and drew connections between the floridness of patients suffering from consumption and the brightness of hyperoxygenated blood, which Priestley had earlier viewed. In the letter, Beddoes documents his self-experimentation, exploring how the inhalation of oxygen created symptoms analogous to consumption. The letter presents, as Mike J notes, a work in progress marked by sceptical experiment rather than a fully worked out theory. So Beddoes documents how he carried out a programme of inhaling air of a much higher than the ordinary standard, often, he says, made up of almost equal parts of oxygen and nitrogen. He employed periodic inhalation of the gas totaling between 20 and 60 minutes every day and recorded the following immediate and long-term effects. I felt at the time of inspiration that agreeable glow and lightness of the chest which has been described by Dr. Priestley and others. In a very short time, I was sensible of a much greater flow of spirits than formerly and was much more disposed to muscular exertion. By degrees, my complexion from a uniform brown became fairer and somewhat florid. I perceived a carnation tint at the ends of the fingers, and on all the covered parts of the body, the skin acquired much more of a flesh colour than it had before. I was rather fat, but during this process I fell away rapidly. My waistcoats becoming very much too large for me. I was not sensible, however, of any muscular emaciation, but rather the contrary. My appetite was good, and I ate 1/3 to 1/4 more than before without feeling my stomach loaded. Beddoes' acknowledgement of Priestley's earlier inhalation of pure oxygen helps both to underpin the process he's carrying out here and to validate the subjective feelings that an excess of oxygen give rise to. Whilst these sensations and dispositions aren't clearly measurable, the subsequent effects on complexion and body mass and appetite can be tested for replication. Crucially, Beddoes notes how a long journey occasioned a meeting with a medical friend who witnessed these effects and was much struck with the flushed appearance of my countenance, and upon feeling my skin and pulse, which varied from 104 to 120, imagined that I was become hectic. The external diagnosis of the hectic fever and elevated pulse that are the hallmarks of early stage consumption help to underline Beddoes' theory about the effects of excessive oxygen. These signs, together with the loss of weight, resistance to the cold and discomfort in the heat, and later in the process a short dry cough, frequent nosebleeds and blood of an unusually bright colour, do accord with the symptoms Beddoes had observed in his own consumptive patients, as well as some of the more generally recognised symptoms of the disease. As in other cases of self-experimentation, the use of the health of a healthy body as test subject is important. Beddoes advertises his own suitability for the role. He says, not having anything of the physical conformation or the slightest hereditary claim to the disease, I thought I might venture very far in oxygenating myself without any great risk, and it was impossible for me to observe the effects so minutely in another person. So like Priestley, he draws on family medical history to suggest that his body is a suitable, healthy instrument for processing the effects of gases. Furthermore, he suggests that the experience of inhalation will bring him closer to the subject, which he is best qualified to analyse. The domestic, everyday nature of Beddoes' self-trial also supports his argument for a very ordinary connection. His recovery from the effects was achieved through a return to normal respiration, keeping quiet and cool, and following a diet high in oil, butter, and cream. The self-experiment therefore appeared to demonstrate that consumption might be a product of the environment, specifically a product of the air. So at least one reader was affronted by Beddoes and his methods. The Golden Age, published in 1794, as if it were Erasmus Darwin's own response to the letter, is an example of the mocking scepticism with which pneumatic medicine was sometimes met. While it's a convincing fake, the poem is commonly recognised as a spoof, not least because of its Oxford publisher. Trevelyan suggests that this might link the poem to one of Beddoes' former university colleagues. The poem paints Beddoes as a dangerous radical, and the golden age of the title is a monstrous future which is permitted by liberty and philosophy. And the usual Virgilian elements are present as the poet presents a pastoral scene in which lambs are born with wool ready dyed and cultivation is unnecessary. But this radical future also has more disturbing elements that fit for a poem that has the loves of the plants as a model, shows plants disrupting their natural order. Beef grows on trees, plants produce butter, and the boundaries between the kingdoms are broken by sensible plants that, susceptible of joy and woe, feel all we feel and know all we know. Beddoes' own contribution to this disruption of natural and social order is shown to be both scientific and political. Crucially, his radicalism is exemplified in the poem by a ridiculing portrait of the self-experimentation regime. Now, this exposes the precarity of his method. It shows how much it's based on the acceptance of the practitioner's authority. If Beddoes looks ridiculous, it throws the whole self-experiment into question. And this is how it's portrayed in the poem. Happy, thrice happy, he who at his will can drink of life's sweet cup his constant fill, who if excess of oxygen creates symptoms which lean consumption indicate, a sure specific can procure with ease rich cream and butter from his herd of trees. Or if he finds excess of hydrogen, his body load with fat, his mind with spleen, true health and vigour to restore can take, from some regenerate oak a savoury steak. So the Darwin-esque couplets here bind together gases and medicine, where excess of oxygen can create consumption and excess of hydrogen results in spleen or melancholy. And the allusion to the happy man of Virgil's Georgics thrusts the experimenting physician into a sphere of practical medicine, with the practical exclusion of medical expertise, when everything can be corrected by inhalation and diet. So this dystopian golden age also shows the physician-patient hierarchy to be at risk. This theory of causation is something that Beddoes later dismissed. He wrote to Watt on the 4th of March 1794 saying, "I do not believe my own theories. For instance, I do not believe in the hyperoxygenation of the system in consumption." And we might say that this neat theory was instead designed to gain the public's interest in subscription fees for the planned pneumatic institution. So seen in this light, his self-experimentation ushered in proof for the efficacy of palliation. And this is something that Travis Chewing Lau has explored. Beddoes does write with an eye to his elite readers, suggesting that oxygen's status as a complexion-altering cosmetic could earn it a place among the ordinary articles of household furniture. However, he's most preoccupied with its medical applications for those suffering acute disease. He also notes that the effects of warmth and increased body mass could be applied to treat many invalids who may be advantageously fortified against the cold of winter by breathing atmospheric air improved with the addition of oxygen air. Several letters in the considerations on the medicinal use and productions of factitious airs account for the treatment of consumptive patients using the inhalation of common air diluted with hydrogen. And these inhalations are joined with other measures such as medicinal barks, fleecy waistcoats to insulate the chest, and sometimes the inhalation of ether. And Beddoes stressed the potential palliative role of gases in medical treatment. He wrote in 1795 that supposing that in a given district there are 10,000 patients where the drugs in use can neither preserve life nor in any considerable degree mitigate pain, of these 10,000 let it be assumed that in 1,000 or in half the number factitious airs are capable of re-establishing health, and in 2,000 others they will prove better palliatives than we possessed before. This defence for incorporating gases into medical practice repeats that emphasis on feeling and experience that characterises Beddoes' experimental work. And of course, this has also a political motive in terms of Beddoes' often repeated aim to rid the medical scene of impostors with their wretched syrups and balsams. In the final volume of his Considerations, Beddoes frames himself in terms very similar to those used by Priestley when he'd introduced his chemical research back in 1775. He says, I desired to be instrumental in diffusing a taste for the most useful species of knowledge and in converting nations into humane societies. This is the art of living, for whose reception men's minds can only be prepared by being familiarized with just ideas concerning animal nature. So Beddoes here expresses a direct medical application in which inhalation is linked both to prevention and palliation. In 1799, he published a guide focusing on the causes and prevention of consumption. And by this point, he was looking to foxglove or digitalis as a possible cure if applied early enough. But in the 1799 volume, he focuses on the situation, living conditions, and occupations of those who are most likely to suffer from the disease. He identifies airless rooms, sedentary occupations, and poor diet and insufficiently warm clothing. For the wealthy women who suffer these conditions, he even suggests the study of chemistry as a potentially healthy and active occupation. So the examples that I've been looking at all show the contingency of scientific knowledge, and this is something that the experimenters are themselves aware of. And even though this qualitative approach to gases was eclipsed by the chemical revolution, these examples show us how scientific authority could operate. Crucially, as I've hopefully shown, the use of one's own body as a test case does not work in isolation. Not only are other experimental examples of witnesses required, but also the verbal framing, the stories that these scientists tell are vital parts of the validation process. For both Priestley and Beddoes, the introduction of the self into science allowed them entry into the market of ideas just as much as it made them vulnerable to criticism. Thank you very much.
wide-ranging, informative, you know, deeply kind of fascinating kind of paper. And you can see the kind of digital applause that is coming your way, and deservedly so. So we have some time for kind of questions to kind of follow up on anything people wanted to from Ros's paper. So if people have questions, they're very welcome to either stick their hand up or to kind of put them in the chat. I wondered, just as people were maybe kind of gathering their thoughts, if I could kind of claim host privilege and ask the first question, if that's okay. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about kind of the intended audience for these kind of publications, like for Priestley and kind of Beddoes. That do you have a sense of what kind of person they're kind of hoping to reach through publishing these works?
I think for Beddoes, it is certainly a broader audience. Partly in terms of what I was saying about trying to attract support, and so medical support as well, but also monetary support for his projected pneumatic institutions. So he is certainly interested in the broader audience. It's also, I think, it's showing his dialogue with other physicians, right? Because many of the case studies that he includes are not from his own treatments, but it's his correspondence. So there's a two-level audience, right, going on there in Beddoes's writing. I think with Priestley, they're not. I mean, Priestley's writings aren't so as widely read as I think he might have wanted them to be. But I think this combination of the theology with the chemistry, and the way that his language of theology percolates through the chemical writing suggests that he has hopes for a wider dissemination. But he's not very helpful at taking his audience along with him in terms of how to actually replicate anything that he's describing.
Well, I'm sure as you know, the academics who are on this call couldn't possibly relate to people not reading their work as much or as widely as we might hope. That's so unrelatable. Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions or comments for Ros? I see something in the chat about how I can't even say it. Phlogisticated is an incredibly fun word. So yeah, you should try and use phlogisticated far more frequently in kind of everyday.
It's somewhat terrifying to say multiple times in a short space of time.
I can imagine. Well, I muffed it the first time, so. I was also really interested in what you were saying about kind of Priestley and his emphasis on surprise, and the way that he's kind of recording his surprise. When you say surprised, is it the kind of surprise that's linked to delight, or is it a surprise that's linked to kind of frustration, or is he just kind of neutrally recording his own emotional state, do you think?
I mean, he does describe things when they don't work as well as when they do. So I think that's something that's really distinctive about his kind of writing, right? It's not this kind of polished final piece. He's taking us through the process, and I think I do see this as a kind of strategy of using the language of surprise. Now, Priestley also, he knows his rhetoric, right? He was teaching and lecturing on oratory at Warrington Academy. So he's using this, I think, knowingly, this as a sort of strategy to tell us about his methods, and perhaps that if we might want to take it with a pinch of salt. Were you really that surprised that an animal could breathe that long in this air after you've already done all these other tests? Are you really that surprised? But I think he's trying to get across the fact that he's coming to this with no preconceptions with no preconceptions of what this gas he's isolated might be and what its properties are.
So kind of as sort of neutral as possible in order to then demonstrate the sort of breadth of responses that those.
Well, and also, I think the very fact that he has isolated this, he's done a really significant experiment, right? And I mean, there are nowadays, of course, questions over who did it first with the isolation of oxygen. But he's also laying claim, right, to this experimental observation that he himself has carried out.
Thank you. There's a question from Eleanor, who, as well as complimenting your kind of awesome talk, said, could you talk more about the competing emphases between emotion and quantitative research? That contrast between Priestley and Lavoisier was so intriguing.
Thank you. That's a great question. So I think on the where I'm positioning my thinking and where I'm looking for self-experimentation naturally falls before Lavoisier comes onto the scene, because Lavoisier is all about measurement and a kind of a qualitative approach. Sorry, quantitative approach is late. So he's all about measurement. So that and that is sort of in the history of chemistry, that's sort of seen as the watershed moment in terms of how approaches to chemistry and to elements really shift. And I mean, Priestley's kind of doing both. I'm necessarily overstating because I'm looking for the elements where he comes in. You know, he is also using apparatus. He is also measuring. Lavoisier says he doesn't measure things very well. And this might also be why it's difficult to replicate Priestley's experiments. So Lavoisier is really very much into precision measurement, and then this exclusion of the body and feeling, I think, is really visible in that experiment that he carries out with Séguin. I suppose that's not to say that Lavoisier is not emotional about his chemistry. Lavoisier and his wife carried out a whole sort of popularizing strategy for the new chemistry, which involved these kind of really dramatic demonstrations and performances, and sort of performing to a live audience. So it's not that chemical emotion goes away, but I think there is that shift towards a different way of thinking about and measuring as well. Thank you for the question.
That's really fascinating. Does anyone else have any questions or thoughts for Ros? I was thinking kind of towards the end of the paper, when you started to talk about kind of Beddoes, about the kind of potential, as it were, kind of public health aspects of it. And again, is that something that's sort of distinctive to Beddoes in that kind of applied thinking about kind of clean air or kind of beneficial air? Or is that something that kind of Priestley and Lavoisier are also kind of engaging with?
This is something that Will Tullett and others have written quite a lot about. So the nitrous air test that Priestley develops is improved and developed into what becomes the eudiometer, which is an instrument for measuring the quality of air. So concomitant with Priestley, those discussions about a different idea of purity of air are also developing. It's not something I know a huge amount about, but there's certainly been a lot of work done on ventilation and the uses of the eudiometer, and that development as well. So and Lavoisier also. He goes into a theatre and does experiments in the corner, measuring the composition of the air during the performance. And he says that it might the decrease in oxygen might make people drowsy, or it might make concentration difficult. For any of you who have to give long lectures, I think we now have an excuse: is the oxygen goes down. that's where the concentration goes.
And indeed, ourselves as spectators, if we're 1 hour and 20 minutes into a 3-hour performance, it's purely because of the lack of oxygen. It's nothing to do with the performance itself. I guess I was thinking about that because of I suppose the most famous experiments that sort of Priestley does in Bristol, which are to do with kind of with nitrous oxide and kind of laughing gas, where there is a kind of plaque to it, that there's this, I suppose, emphasis on kind of playfulness, as opposed to kind of endeavor, at least in the kind of broader kind of cultural sort of recollections of that.
Well, and I think that's also a kind of send up, right, of the experiments with nitrous oxide. Is sort of lampooning of what the pneumatic institution is trying to do, and I think we see a foretaste of that in that mock poem about Beddoes' experiment, right? The ridiculing of it, the way in which the dangerous radicalism. Burke talks about chemistry being linked to radicalism, right? And on his reflections of the revolution, and I think that kind of counterbalance of and Priestley, of course, is very much associated with radicalism as well, and part of the response to that is mockery and an emphasis on the levity rather than the knowledge. So that was, I suppose, that's slightly to kind of counter the association between levity and what Davy is doing later as well.
Okay. We might take this as our kind of final question, as we're kind of coming up to the hour, which is from Warren, saying, I was intrigued by the illustration of the respiratory test. I was intrigued by that illustration as well. Could you talk more about the framing or discussion of danger to the experimental subject, precautions or lack thereof put in place, etc.?
I'm also intrigued by this illustration. And there has been some work done on this. I think these sort of the kind of ethical questions of having a human subject. This is about that ethical question, I think, of having the human subject involved. Now, there's in that case, we're not sure whether this is Seguin, one of the experimenters who's in the picture. So there are a set of questions which are about ethics and danger to participants rather than the experimenter themselves. When it comes to self-experimentation, sometimes risk can be a kind of validating hallmark, I think. I'm thinking of some of the other examples of self-experimentation that I'm looking at. Anton Sturck develops hemlock pills, and he tries them first on some animals and then tries them on himself. And then he trials them on patients. And he's sort of stepping in, right, to test on a human body. And in that way, he's kind of sidestepping that kind of that ethical quandary. In some cases, with self-experimenters, it's absolutely foolhardy, and they don't survive the process. But in some way, that kind of having the self-experimenter as being the subject, in some ways, it kind of sidesteps that whole quandary. I think that's sort of a sideways answer to your question, but thank you.
And I think kind of I know very little about this, but that question about self-experimentation has kind of started to come back into kind of contemporary medicine as well, right? And like and all the kind of ethics that are around that. So as ever, the 18th century has something that it can teach the 21st.
Yep. They were hacking the body before the tech bros came in.
It has just kind of gone to the hour, so we might kind of start drawing things to a close. I guess I just want to kind of flag the next meeting of ODSECS, which is on the 20th of November at the same time, where Lama Al Sharif will be talking about North African corsairs. We are nothing if not varied on ODSECS, so that looks to be another really kind of fascinating paper, and we hope you'll be able to join us for that as well. But we'll just want to kind of end by thanking this month's speaker again, Ros Powell. Thanks so much, Ros, for a really kind of brilliant paper.
Thank you.